Hello everyone. I wanted to share with you some of the adaptation techniques that I use on my mirrorless camera to shoot with some of these really old vintage and not so old vintage lenses. These lenses have so much character and so much bokeh and color and tone. They are just sort of unique in their own rights. And also with those lenses I shoot projector lenses from movie cameras and also from slide projectors, and I shoot lenses that I found on pieces of equipment that were never meant to be used on a camera, and I use some aerial photo camera lenses, things that are not normal and not normally used, and all of them have their own characteristic and their own enjoyment for me anyway to use. So I'm going to share with you some of my techniques for adapting these lenses on my mirrorless camera. Now they can also be sort of adapted on digital single lens reflex cameras and old film cameras, but you're very limited when you use those cameras, and so I'm just going to leave that part out and you can investigate that yourself if you desire. But I will show you some of the lenses I use and how I connect them up. Hope you enjoy it. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the flange focal distance, which is a confusing term and rather scientific, but I'm going to just make it simple and show you how I use it. As seen in this diagram here, which I got off of the internet, this film or the sensor, whatever it is, wherever the image is recorded, and the faceplate on the camera, between these two distances is the flange focal distance. And this is related to the camera mount, but in reality I consider it related to the lens mount. And the reason I say that is because you can get lenses, let's say this is a Canon, you can get lenses made by Canon, or you can get lenses made by Tamron or some other company, and they will work because they know what the flange focal distance is for the Canon. If you go on Wikipedia, you can search for flange focal distance and it'll give you a whole bunch of information along with that diagram I just showed you, and give you a table, a very large table that shows the flange focal distances for cameras, whatever camera it is. And in my case I'm talking about whatever camera lens mount we're talking about. So why do I care about flange distance, and what does it have to do with any of this? That's all the way in, that's infinity, and that's all the way out. And you can see that the lens is now extended out the front. This is the minimum focus distance for this lens. All of the lenses that were ever made for cameras have a lens mount that has its own flange distance. And when you want to use one of these lenses on your camera, you have to make sure that the flange distance for infinity is somewhere where the camera can get to, so that you can see infinity when you use the lens. That brings me to the next point, mirrorless cameras. This is a Nikon Z6, and the flange distance on this is very small. It's like 16 millimeters. And you can see the sensor down in there, which isn't very far away, and you can see the lens mount right here. So the 16 millimeters is the measurement from the sensor front to this mount. So on most mirrorless cameras, we have a very short flange distance. This is an M42 mount lens. And there are many cameras that use M42. It was an old style mount that was used from, I don't know how early, but certainly very early and all the way through to the 1980s, maybe 1990s. The flange distance for this M42 is some number. I'm just going to throw a number out. It's 47 millimeters. So the Z6 has a 16 millimeter flange distance. The M42 has a 47 millimeter flange distance. So when I want to use this M42 lens on this Nikon Z6, I need to get the lens to be 46 millimeters away from the sensor in order to see infinity. This is a Pentax K mount, and the flange distance for that is different than the M42. And so it goes with all sorts of different lens mounts. This is an exacta mount. Can you see that? Exacta mount. It's bayonet. It's used on a lot of old cameras. It has its own flange distance. Now how do we get these lenses onto the camera with the correct flange distance so we can use them to see infinity? The first option is called a fixed adapter. And this is a fixed adapter for M42 for a Nikon Z mount camera. So when I put this onto the front of the camera and attach the M42 lens, I will have precisely the distance required to reach infinity with this lens. So here you go. Here's the camera, the M42 lens, and the fixed adapter, and now this camera can use this lens as if it was made for this camera. It can get infinity, and then it can focus all the way down to whatever the minimum focus distance is for this lens. That said, that's not the way I use my lenses. I do not use fixed adapters unless I absolutely have to. So these two pieces here are what I use to make an M42 lens work on my camera. And why would I use this instead of this? This is the adapter for the camera that gives me M42 threading. So I put this on the camera and I can screw in an M42 lens or M42 something. I call this the thin adapter, and there's the thin adapter on my Nikon. Helicoids are something like the old bellows that was used in old cameras. A helicoid is basically a focusing ring, and it opens and closes by turning the dial here on this lens. That's the minimum distance on this particular helicoid, and that's the maximum distance on this particular helicoid. So the flange distance for an M42 is some number, and this thin adapter and this helicoid are going to be part of that number that I'm going to use to make this M42 lens work on my camera. Okay, so here's the helicoid and the lens and the thin adapter on my camera. Now, am I going to get infinity with this? As long as I can get to the flange distance required for the M42 lens, I can. And you can see the fixed adapter, which it has the correct distance for the flange adjustment, compared to the shortened version of the helicoid. The helicoid is a little too close. But since the helicoid allows for the outward movement of the lens, I can adjust it so that I get the precise flange focus distance for the lens. Okay, so why do I want to do that instead of using this fixed adapter? That seems pretty ridiculous, really, doesn't it? Well, one of the points I made earlier was that the helicoid can extend out pretty far. So here's the helicoid extended all the way out. It's much further than it was with the fixed adapter. Much further. Remember I said that when the lens optics moves further away from the camera, we're getting closer and closer to the subject. As long as the optics of the lens are capable of doing really close-up photography, you can use basically any lens on this helicoid that's an M42 and get close-up photography with it. So the benefit of the helicoid over the fixed adapter is I can extend the minimum focus distance on the lens much further than I could have without the helicoid. There are many M42 lenses, and some of them are very, very good. And they have incredible bokeh and good color and good sharpness and the kind of things that you would want in a lens. This is M42 thread, so it's very simple. You just screw this lens into that and you're good. Okay, so what about lenses that aren't M42? How do you get them to mount onto a helicoid? Well, most of the adapters that I use that are not M42 require an M65 helicoid. M65 is 65 millimeters in diameter for the threading, and M42 is 42 millimeters in diameter for the threading on both sides. This is how I attach the M65 helicoid to my camera. It's another thin adapter. It has Nikon Z on this side, and it has M65 threads on this side. So there's the M65 helicoid attached to my camera. So this mates with the Exacta, and then the whole thing goes into the camera. There's the adapter with the lens. There's the camera, the lens, and the helicoid all together. So here's some other lenses that are not normal camera lenses that I use a lot. This is a projector lens from a 35mm slide projector. That's also a slide projector lens. This is a interesting lens. This came from an oscilloscope camera that was used in engineering labs when they wanted to take pictures of the front of the oscilloscope. This is a very unique lens, and it's actually an aircraft camera lens from the Soviet Union, probably used in the 1970s through 1980, late 80s. This actually has a diaphragm in it, so it can do aperture, closing and opening. This has a diaphragm in it, so it can do opening and closing. These two do not, these slide projector lenses do not have apertures, so they're open wide all the time. The flange distances on these lenses varies, and I basically have to evaluate the lens and determine what the flange distance is for the lens and how I would set it up on my camera. This is an extension tube that I use on an M65 helicoid when I need longer distances, flange distances. Well, there's a company called RAF Camera, and I'll put the link in the video, that I buy a lot of my parts from. This is a real high quality machine shop, and they tailor to photographers who want to adapt lenses to cameras. They're not cheap products, but they're well made, all CNC machine made. You can get some of these products from the Chinese on eBay, and they're not nearly the same quality, and they don't have this selection, but they're cheap. And this is probably an example of how I would use this lens. It's pretty heavy, but I have a helicoid for focusing, and I have apertures here, so the lens is ready to go. And it's a very large format lens, so it covers the full frame LCD in my camera very well, and I only use the very center parts of the glass and the optics. This is a very unique lens, and I really like what it gives me. It's not real sharp, does not have a real high resolution, but it has incredible bokeh, and it's just a beautiful lens to use, and I love taking close-up photography with it. And it just screws in just like everything else. There are quality projector lenses that were used on slide projectors. Both of these are very high quality, very sharp, very good color, just good all-around lenses. They're not camera lenses. They shouldn't be used for infinity shots, but they're very good for medium to close range photography. I don't know if you can see inside this collar, but it's got a piece of steel wire, spring wire inside, and it's got 3 set screws, and basically you clamp down, you tighten these set screws, and they clamp the spring wire onto the lens and don't mar the lens, but they tighten up really good. So there it is, mounted, and then this just screws into a helicoid, and with the correct flange distance it works great. I check it for infinity, even though I don't use it for infinity, but I always get macro photography with these lenses. And there's the other lens with the collar loosely put on there. Same thing, you just put it on the helicoid and you're good to go. I want to talk one more thing, and that would be how do I adapt, let's say I have a Pentax K lens, which I do here, and I want to put it on a helicoid. How do I do that? You cannot find adapters for the lenses to go on helicoids, and not very good ones, and not very many of them. So you make your own, or you get someone who you know has a metal lathe and they can make one for you. This is the adapter that I would use to mount my PK lens onto my helicoid. This is a pretty standard adapter, but it's not generically made ready to be used on a helicoid. It is actually a PK to EOS adapter. So it had EOS on the back side and PK on the front side. I machined the back side of this and basically removed most of the EOS bayonet mount. This is a standard ring, probably M65 on the outside and M52 on the inside. You get these off eBay. I drilled and tapped 3 holes for set screws, and I painted this white so that I would know this ring was meant to be used with one of these adapters. Put the adapter on there like that. Tighten down the set screws, and this whole thing can then screw in to a helicoid. And here's my PK lens as an example, one of them. And this fits in there and locks in place. There's no communications with the camera, but I don't need it. Ultimately, you have to invest some money into these adapters and these helicoids and these rings and such like that. But they are reusable, many of them are. There's still money to be invested, so if you get a really cheap lens and then you have to spend more than the lens costs just to get an adapter, you're going to think twice about it. Let me make one more comment about how I set my camera up. There is no electrical communication between the camera and the lens. Certainly nothing in the helicoid. It's like using a dummy extension tube. So how do I get my camera to talk right and to work right? In my case, I set the camera to aperture mode. As far as the aperture goes, it's aperture mode, but there is no aperture control on the camera, so it's sort of a fake mode for me. The camera uses whatever it sees coming in from the lens and just assumes that you know what you're doing and you set the aperture correctly, and it adjusts accordingly. Perfect. So this is basically the old style of taking photographs. No auto anything, except for maybe auto speed and auto ISO. You're looking through the viewfinder on this camera. I can zoom to 200% and focus right down to the finest detail I need. So I manually focus everything, and I use the magnification setting a lot because my eyes are not as good as they used to be. Well, there you go. Thank you for listening and following along. Thanks again.